How did the flight of enslaved people from south to north precipitate the Civil War? Andrew Delbanco will join us to talk about his new book, The War Before the War. What's that living on your pillowcase and thriving inside your shower head? Rob Dunn offers a window into the wildlife inhabiting your house in his new book, Never Home Alone. Plus, our critics will discuss the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Andrew Delbanco joins us now by phone from Florida. He is the Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University, the author of many books, most recently a book about college called College, and now his new book is The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. Andrew, thanks for being here.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So implicit in this title is the idea that the existence of, the persistence of fugitive slaves somehow constituted a war in and of itself prior to the Civil War. Would that be accurate?
I think it would be accurate. The way I tell this story is that, and it was something I kind of came to understand more deeply as I read for and thought about the issue, is that fundamentally we were two countries. We were two countries when the delegates came to Philadelphia to try to create a constitution for one country. In one of those countries, slavery was the bedrock of the economy and the culture. In the other, the northern half, slavery was becoming increasingly marginal or peripheral, and it was clearly en route to extinction. So one of the problems the founders faced was what would be the status of a human being who was enslaved by state law in one of the southern states, who took him or herself physically in search of freedom to a state where slavery was illegal. In order to address that problem, they introduced into the Constitution what might be described as a sort of intranational extradition treaty, the notorious Fugitive Slave Clause, which in very vague language said, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, that anyone owing service or labor in one state cannot escape that obligation by fleeing to another state. And that's where, in a sense, the story begins, although the problem of human beings trying to flee from slavery was an ancient one. And the politics, the legal history, literary history of the early United States for the next 75 years, in my view, had this problem at its center.
Okay, so jumping ahead a little bit, in what ways was that Fugitive Slave Clause different from the much later Fugitive Slave Act?
Well, the Fugitive Slave Clause was cast in very passive, vague language, as you could maybe hear in my paraphrase. It didn't say anything about what authority would return these human beings to the person to whom they owed service or labor. Would it be the local police department in Massachusetts or Connecticut? Would it be the state government? Would it be the federal government, which was a very weak entity in the early decades of the Republic? It kind of punted those questions. It assumed that they would somehow get resolved. And in fact, there's a good argument that most of the founders believed that slavery was an institution that would go away. They weren't clear how, but it seemed like history was moving in that direction. Even slave owners like Thomas Jefferson, in a famous phrase, said, "The spirit of the slave is rising, the spirit of the master is abating." They believed that the problem would go away. History proved them to be dead wrong about that, and so the problem only became more and more acute.
So given the vague nature of that initial Fugitive Slave Clause, what did enforcement of that look like prior to the Fugitive Slave Act?
It was chaotic and anarchic. Essentially, Southerners who were outraged by the idea that Northerners paid no respect to their so-called human property rights would personally, or they would send bounty hunters, say, pay some money to somebody and say, "Look, I heard a report that so-and-so who belongs to me is now in Pennsylvania or is now in Ohio. Go get him, bring him back." And so conflict ensued between citizens of the northern states and citizens of the southern states, between law enforcement entities. Conflict sometimes went into the courts. Congress tried to do something about this in the 1790s, but they failed to put teeth into that toothless clause. So in 1850, when the crisis over slavery had reached the boiling point for many other reasons, the question of the federal territories and a number of other issues, the Congress tried to solve the problem once and for all by passing a new law, which I describe in the book, I think fairly, as a merciless law. It stated that an accused fugitive had no right to the most basic right in the Anglo-American legal tradition, the right of habeas corpus. That is, such a person could not challenge the legality of his or her detention in open court. He or she had no right to a jury trial, no right to testify in his or her own defense. Moreover, any citizen who came to his or her aid to harbor or abet a fugitive, in the language of the law, was committing a federal crime according to this new law of 1850. And not quite a new class, but an enlarged class of federal officers called commissioners was created, who had the authority to hold a kind of private hearing, look at a piece of paper provided by the so-called owner of this person, and decide whether that person should be sent back to slavery or not. So this was a law that was intended to hold the country together at a time around 1850 when it seemed very possible that it was coming apart. Instead, it had exactly the opposite effect.
How did a law like this get passed? I mean, presumably the South was 100% behind it, but to what extent did the northern states vote for this, and how did that fit into the larger compromise of 1850?
Well, this is very much the heart of my story. You're quite right. It received virtually 100% support in the South, although there were Southerners, particularly in the Deep South, who believed it wouldn't work, who saw that passing a law that ran counter to the commitments and convictions of local communities in the North would never hold. Nevertheless, they signed on to it as a kind of almost symbolic gesture of asserting what they thought of as their property rights. In the North, the situation was, of course, much more complicated. And part of the story I tell is the dilemma, the inner conflict that some white Northerners felt, who on the one hand were morally deeply opposed to slavery as an indefensible institution, and indeed to the law as morally indefensible, but who on the other hand really did sincerely believe that without such a pact, which was after all built into the Constitution, the country would come apart. And that group of Northerners included Abraham Lincoln, who famously said in a letter to a friend of 1855, I think it was, "I hate to see the poor creatures hunted down and return to their stripes, but I bite my lip and keep quiet." And a large part of my book is devoted to trying to explain how it was possible for someone like Lincoln, who genuinely hated slavery, to make that accommodation. It's not a question of was he right or wrong. It's easy to judge people in the past, which we do all the time. But I think there's some value in trying to return us to the complexity of the moment and the dilemma they found themselves in. One last point on that question. It seemed quite possible that if the South seceded in 1850 and went its own way, it would create a slave-based empire. It would go deeper into Mexico. It would seize Cuba. It would move into the Caribbean. So the point is that if secession had happened in 1850, it might have been a victory for slavery. And people like Lincoln made the calculation that ultimately, if you were interested in trying to drive slavery into extinction, holding the country together in 1850 was the right choice.
Let's talk a little bit more about the specifics of what that compromise was. I mean, there was a huge amount of territory that then entered the Union as slave states, right? What did the North get out of this sort of pragmatic concession?
Well, from the Southern point of view, the North got a lot out of it. I mean, California, which was the largest single piece of territory that had been seized from Mexico in the wake of the Mexican War, came in as a free state. They tried to make a compromise in the District of Columbia where they agreed to abolish the slave trade, although that was largely symbolic because you could just go across the river into Virginia and buy and sell slaves as much as you liked. But from the Southern point of view, the compromise was mainly a victory for the North. And that's why, one reason why, they insisted that this fugitive slave law had to be included in the compromise. They had to, Southern senators needed to go back to their constituents and say, look, this is what we got. And it was the fugitive slave law, therefore, that became the great symbol of the conflict between North and South. More symbolic, I think, than substantive, because in fact, since slavery was such an odious and an efficient system, a relatively small number of slaves were actually able to escape to the North. But their significance politically and symbolically was far in excess of their numbers.
But despite the sort of moral rectitude of the abolitionist movement, there was still pervasive racism in the North, right? I mean, they were not monolithically opposed to slavery as long as it didn't exist within their territory.
Well, this is absolutely true, and it's another one of these, we like to think of the past in simple terms of good and evil, and I don't think any reasonable person could possibly argue that slavery itself, that there was any gray area about slavery itself. But there certainly were gray areas about those who reluctantly supported that law and those who opposed slavery, the abolitionists, as you mentioned. The North was not a friendly place for black people. And in fact, one of the revelations from the writings and speeches of fugitive slaves was how difficult they found life in the North, where, yes, they had the right to earn wages and keep what they were paid, which is no small difference between free labor and slave labor. But in terms of human dignity, in terms of being treated with respect, in terms of being regarded as American citizens, we were a long way from any kind of racial equality. And there were indeed some people who opposed slavery, not because they were concerned with the welfare or rights of black people, but because they didn't want black people in their neighborhood.
Right. We're taking away their jobs, right, with new immigrant groups moving into the cities.
Absolutely. New immigrants from Ireland and elsewhere in Boston and New York were extremely hostile to slaves and human beings who had run away from slavery because they saw them as competition for their livelihood in something like the same way that some Americans are at least being told that the illegal immigrants of our own time are threatening their welfare.
Let's talk about the fate of those enslaved people who did get to the North. First of all, how large a phenomenon was this, and did it exist? You mentioned at the beginning that fugitive slaves have existed for as long as there have been slaves, but how pervasive a phenomenon was it in the U.S.?
Well, this is one of those numerical questions that historians are still arguing over. You get estimates anywhere from 50,000 a year down to closer to 1,000 a year. I'm inclined to think that the lower number is more accurate. It's a very hard thing to measure because you get into the issue of how do you identify a fugitive slave, someone who has managed to escape for a period of time, who finds sanctuary relatively close to the plantation or to the city where he or she had been enslaved. Or are we talking about people who actually got to the North and made a new life or went through the North to Canada or even in some cases to Britain to achieve a full, secure level of freedom? The number of those people is relatively small. Some of them were very famous and very eloquent, most notably Frederick Douglass, but there were many others. So one of the things I learned, and I think readers of the book would learn, is that black people were really caught between slave owners who wanted them to remain with them as non-persons and Northerners who really had not much interest in having them in their neighborhood at all. It was not an easy thing to be black in antebellum America. It still isn't, but the severity of the conditions that these people faced is something that I think all Americans should remember when we think about our history.
It's also it's presumably misleading to talk about the North as a kind of monolithic entity just in terms of the geography, right? Presumably there were some states that were easier to escape to, perhaps easier to sort of integrate into or at least find work, and then others that were more hostile. Like what did that look like?
Well, that's right. I mean, there were centers of resistance to slavery in the North, centers of what we now call the Underground Railroad, local vigilance committees that sort of were on the watch for slave hunters coming north and exercised all kinds of actions to try to protect fugitives, places like New Bedford, Mass., Rochester, New York, to some extent, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Ohio. But there were other places, in New York City, for instance, though it had its vigilance committee, where sympathy to what became the Confederacy was rather high, and sympathy for runaway black people was very low. So one of the phenomena you see is fugitives, and this included people like Douglass, moving from place to place in search of a place where they could lead any kind of a dignified, secure life.
It strikes me there's a parallel in many ways, with the Great Migration the post-Civil War. And in one way, was there a sentiment among Southerners that the North was, and presumably primarily the abolitionists and the writers and intellectuals, luring slaves away the same way that later the South accused, Northern companies of recruiters coming and taking away, quote unquote, their slaves?
Absolutely. And the pro-slavery ideologues in the South made the case very forcefully that, in fact, black people were better off as slaves than they would be as industrial workers, where they would be discarded at the first injury, where they would be replaced by a new immigrant, where the wages, although theoretically a different thing from being enslaved, were inadequate to live on. Now, we can see all of this as a rationalization for the defense of slavery, and that's indeed what it was. That doesn't mean that in some cases slave owners were not sincere in believing that the human beings whom they had inherited from their parents or grandparents were better off living under what they thought of as the benign conditions of slavery than in the North, where they would be exploited. There's no defense of slavery. But I think that in order to understand the complexity of our history, we ought to try to see the world from multiple points of view, and I try to do that in this book, from the point of view of the fugitives themselves primarily, which I think is something we've scanted in our history, to the most radical abolitionists, to the most frothing defenders of slavery. That's the American story, and to simplify it doesn't do us any good.
So slavery existed from the earliest days of the colonial period. Fugitive slaves existed. The Fugitive Slave Clause existed in the Constitution. What did the Fugitive Slave Act do that changed all of this? You said earlier this was meant to fix the problem, but it had the opposite effect.
Well, the short answer to that, I think, is that Northerners, and maybe there's an echo here of some of the ways in which we live in the world, Northerners were very good at convincing themselves that slavery was somebody else's problem. Slavery was a faraway thing. It was regrettable. You shook your head when you read about it in the newspaper, but it had nothing to do with you. That, of course, was never true. The textile mills in the North were spinning slave-grown cotton into cloth. The banks were financing the plantations. So Northerners were up to their eyeballs in slavery, but they were adept, as we are adept, at closing their eyes and pretending that they're not too interested in where the products that they consumed were coming from. Ralph Waldo Emerson at one point said, when we in New England put the sugar in our tea or in our cake, no one tasted blood in the treats. I think the fugitive slave law changed that, because suddenly you were complicit. Suddenly you were required to turn in a human being who might have been living in your neighborhood for years and send him or her back to slavery. You could literally, in Boston in the 1850s, on several occasions, you could see a neighbor, a black person, being dragged in shackles to the local jailhouse and then being put on a ship and sent back to Savannah or Newport News or somewhere in the South, where they were going to be collected by a very angry master.
So it basically turned everyone into a kind of vigilante, where, like in the communist era, where you could report on your neighbors and sort of turn them over to the state.
That's right. And it forced people to face the question of, what do I do in the face of this unjust law? Mm-hmm. The law tells me this is my role as a respectable citizen, is to be, as you just put it, a vigilante. But my conscience tells me something different. I'm looking into the eyes of a human being who's being treated as a non-person. And that phenomenon, which built in intensity throughout the 1850s and that the abolitionists took good advantage of by publishing the memoirs of fugitive slaves, by encouraging fugitives to speak at public rallies and present themselves as flesh and blood human beings, that phenomenon, in my view, helped to drive the country to the ultimate breaking point and the Civil War itself.
You quoted Emerson earlier, which is not surprising. As a literary scholar, how did the journalists and poets and polemicists and novelists, how did they respond to the Fugitive Slave Act, and how influential was that response?
Well, the journalists were very important, and one of the phenomena of this period is the rise of black newspapers. Black people became fully participating members in American public and intellectual life for the first time. And that was one of the other consequences of the Fugitive Slave Law. The writers whom we tend to honor by calling them classics, Hawthorne, Whitman, Edgar Allan Poe was a Southerner and certainly had no interest in the welfare of slaves or fugitive slaves. But they, by and large, looked away. Whitman writes a little bit about the problem, but to my ear, it's mostly about his own virtue in being on the right side of the question. Hawthorne was quite conservative and hoped that slavery would somehow go away, but he was very suspicious of agitators. Melville was the only one of the major writers who looked squarely at slavery and wrote about its horrors as best he could as a white outsider to the institution. Now, does that mean that we should write off these writers and condemn them for their myopia? I'm not sure about that. The great writers don't always take up the pressing issue of the day. But if we want to be accurate about where they stood, we find them mostly standing to the side.
Where can we read Melville's writing on slavery?
Well, slavery is actually all over Moby Dick in discrete passages and in certain symbolic ways. But the work in which he most directly addresses it is the great novella of the mid-1850s called Benito Cereno, which is the story of a murderous revolt by slaves aboard a Spanish slave ship and the complete inability of the New England narrator of the story to understand what he is seeing or to plumb the depths of what might drive human beings to the fury and despair that is acted out in that story. I think it's one of the great works of American literature with which we still haven't fully come to terms.
And that novella was based on an actual historical event.
Yes, it was. Melville, like Shakespeare, often took his stories from other sources, but once he was through with it, it was quite another thing.
Was it read at the time as an overt kind of analogy or metaphor for what was going on in the United States?
The truth is, Melville wasn't very much read in his time. It's hard to say. I mean, it was published in the Putnam's Magazine, which was, broadly speaking, an anti-slavery periodical. So I don't think there was any mystery about what side of the question Melville was on. But did it have an effect the way certain other books, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was read by a lot of people? No, it didn't. It was really rediscovered by English professors in the 20th century.
So it was really the abolitionist press, the free black press, and slave narratives that were sort of had the most influence on public opinion.
I think that's a fair statement. And one of the good things that's happened in recent years is that we've come to a broader conception of what American literature was in the middle of the 19th century. And whereas 50 years ago, nobody was reading black writers except maybe the first volume of Frederick Douglass's memoir, nowadays you cannot teach a course in American literature without including texts by black people, including black people who had once been enslaved, and that's just as it should be.
In your introduction, you write that the Fugitive Slave Act takes us back to a time when the public and the personal became indistinguishable. What do you mean by that? And you go ahead and then tie it to up to today, to the Black Lives Matter movement.
You know, I think any responsible historian has to be wary of parallels with the present. And yet at the same time, I don't see why we should be interested in the past if we didn't see reflections of ourselves. What I meant by that is that, we're all very good at leading our daily lives, our private lives, and setting aside the things that we don't want to know about in the broader world. Now and again, something happens that makes it almost impossible to do that. Often it's a catastrophe, like a war or a terrorist attack or something of that sort. That began to happen, I think, in the 1850s, and the fugitive slave law was an important force in bringing the public and the personal together for more and more Americans, and thereby, I think, woke them up to the fact that this was an existential moral problem. How could you have a democratic republic based on the principle of liberty and equality in which millions of human beings were enslaved, some of whom were courageous enough to actually escape and tell you about it? It became more difficult to keep one's head in the sand.
Well, you may be wary of parallels, but that's a pretty persuasive one. Andrew, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Andrew Delbanco is a professor of American Studies at Columbia University. His most recent book is The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul from the Revolution to the Civil War. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Rob Dunn joins us now from North Carolina. He is the author of Never Home Alone, From Microbes to Millipedes, Camel Crickets and Honeybees, The Natural History of Where We Live. Rob, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So in addition to writing books, this is your, I think, 6th book, you are a professor of applied ecology at North Carolina State University and in the Natural History Museum of Denmark at the University of Copenhagen. So do you go back and forth between Denmark and North Carolina?
I do. When it gets super hot here in North Carolina in the summers, my family and I leave for Europe. Yeah, it's a good deal.
That's a nice arrangement. What does a professor of applied ecology, what does that actually mean, applied ecology?
Well, so ecology is the study of the sort of general rules of life. And so if you imagine life on some other planet, what are the rules that would still apply? And applied ecology just means that we try to make those rules useful. How do we figure out the ways nature tends to behave and then use those to our advantage? And so sometimes that's figuring out how to make more fish. Other times it's figuring out how to manage endangered species. And in my case, it's all sorts of unusual things like making new beers or finding microbes in the guts of insects that can turn waste into energy, things like that.
What is your specific area of research?
I mean, I'm really broad, but right now a lot of my work focuses on the life in homes. And so what's in your refrigerator, what's under your bed, to what extent do those things in your refrigerator and under your bed still obey the rules we figured out in studying a rainforest? And how do we work with the public to understand those sorts of things?
And why study what's in our homes? I mean, clearly, or perhaps I'm wrong, it's not doing us any harm or not a lot of harm. Otherwise, we wouldn't be spending so much time in our homes. Like, what is there to discover within that little biosphere?
One reason to study is we now spend 23 and a half hours of the day in our houses or in our cars. And so to the extent that we're exposed to the rest of life, that's where it happens. And so it seems like if we're going to understand any place on Earth, we should at least understand the indoors. And then the other thing is that as I started off in tropical ecology, I started off studying rainforests. And as I've moved into homes, I've realized that we're so ignorant about the biological world still that we can make super basic new discoveries really right where we live. And so the idea that we don't understand where we live and that if we do start to understand it, it affects us every day, I think it makes it an important place to study.
So given how much time we spend in our homes and our cars, I'm assuming the cars being a kind of extension of the home, the idea that we are disconnected from nature is perhaps not entirely accurate because there is a lot of nature or natural life in our houses. Like, what's in there?
Collectively, we found hundreds of thousands, at least 100,000 species, probably more like 200,000 species indoors. And so there's the potential for lots of kinds of species. But one of the things that we see is that it varies a lot from home to home, and it's probably changed a lot in the last few hundred years. And so on the one end of the spectrum, you have homes that are kind of like the space station where we've sealed everything up. And in those homes, you mostly have microbes associated with our own bodies, our own sort of falling apart. And then you have microbes that live in the weird new habitats we've made. And so in salt shakers, in your freezer, in your dishwasher, in your washing machine. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have homes that are more open to the environment. And in those homes, you have that body species, the salt shaker species, but you also have a lot of environmental species that have drifted in. And so the collective potential of what you might be exposed to is really great. But what we tend to be doing is moving toward that space station model. And so if you think about the average apartment in New York, it's much more like the space station. So it has weird stuff from our bodies and weird stuff from those strange new habitats. And so hot water heaters have unusual species we don't find other places. We even find species living in microwaves. And so all around you, there's stuff.
The example that is most frequently cited when people talk about the various wildlife in the house is the kitchen sponge. And I've often thought that's like a plot by the paper towel industry. But people say the kitchen sponge is full of, I don't know how many horrible little creatures. Is it actually an exception, or are there just as many of these microbial and microscopic wildlife all over the house?
No, I mean, your whole house is just covered with life. And I mean, we've swabbed thousands and thousands of sites within houses, and we've never swabbed a spot in a house or a hospital that isn't full of life. And so I think we need to sort of check our baseline assumption. And the baseline should be that things are full of life. And what's unusual is if they're not, or if some particular form of life becomes really dominant. But the sponge is not so unusual.
Is the majority of these creatures, are the majority of them innocuous?
No biologists agree about how many kinds of bacteria, for example, there are in the world, but it's certainly millions, and some would argue trillions. And of those species, fewer than 50 cause humans any regular harm. And so, the vast majority of the species you're likely to encounter in your house are either harmless or actually beneficial.
Well, okay, let's talk about the harm, because that's where everyone's mind will immediately go to those 50 species. What are the most prevalent, and are there areas where people should be particularly attentive to? Are there signs of that is not a good microbe relative to all the others?
One of the tricks with all of this is a lot of this life we can't see, and so it's easy for it all to become really scary because you can throw into that abyss of the invisible as much fear and danger as you want. And there's no way to confirm whether your perceptions of that danger are right or wrong. But for the most part, if you wash your hands with soap and water and you have access to clean drinking water and you vaccinate yourself and your family and encourage your friends to get vaccinated, that those standard public health measures, that those do a great job of keeping those 50 species at bay. And then also things like in your refrigerator, when things are past their shelf life, getting rid of them. That those are all ways that we have figured out to, and with pretty simple measures, keep the stuff we don't want in our homes from being there. And that's work. That saves tens of millions of lives.
But we've gone overboard.
We've totally gone overboard. And so we've started to imagine that beyond those simple measures, that if we can get rid of all of it, that would be even more beneficial. But the problem with that is sort of the problem that you might imagine if you think through what most cleaning products suggest. And so most of them suggest they kill 99% of germs or 99% of insects or 99% of whatever. But what that means is that 1% survives. And what tends to happen is that 1% is not the kindest, most gentle 1%. It's the toughest, nastiest stuff. And so when you overuse antimicrobial products, when you overuse antibiotics, when you spray pesticides around your house, what you're favoring is that 1% that is no more likable than the human 1% with all the money.
I mean, are you getting rid of the natural predators of that 1% while you're wiping out the 99%?
Yeah, so a good example would be in the context of spiders. And so pesticides really good at getting rid of spiders, not as good at getting rid of mosquitoes that carry deadly pathogens. And so you spray pesticides around your house, it kills all the spiders, it kills the mosquitoes that happen to be inside, and then the mosquitoes come back in and they have no spiders to eat them, and they do even better than they did before. And so something like that's happening with your bacteria, with the fungi, with all the rest.
So is what's happening in hospitals where we are, developing these kind of super bugs, these very hardy strains of like MRSA and other strains of the staph virus, is that happening in the home as well?
some version of that is for sure happening in the home. We have actually far less understanding of how that's happening than you might imagine we would. But for example, so we know that on our bodies, if we overuse antibiotics, that we're doing something very similar to what happens in hospitals, and we're favoring those resistant bugs. We know that when you have those antimicrobial dispensers that sort of spray out the goop onto your hands that you rub around, that on those dispensers, most microbes are killed, except for some really nasty ones that actually like to live on those dispensers and like to live on the antimicrobial compound. And so the same sorts of things that you see in hospitals are happening in houses, not in identical ways, but in similar enough ways that we should be worried.
So is the best advice in the home to sort of toss the Purell, toss the antimicrobial soaps, use the least amount of pesticides possible, and let most of this flourish?
Yeah, open your windows, let a little bit of biodiversity back in. If you know you've got something bad, or if you know your kids were just sick, wash your hands a little bit more than you already do. Make sure you're vaccinated. Ferment some great foods in your kitchen. Throw out foods when they go bad. It's sort of a dopey, boring end result, because it's really the suggestion that we need to have a little bit more moderation in how we manage the life around us. And it seems like that's not a point we should have to make. And yet we've gone so far toward making these superficially sterile environments around ourselves that it's really harming us, and it's harming our families, and it doesn't seem like there's any abatement to this trend that, we seem ever more likely to use ever more of these biocides. And so we really need to make some major changes if we don't want to be plagued by all sorts of chronic diseases and new pathogens in the future.
But it's not just about the soaps and the chemicals that we're spreading around. It's also about the construction of the home, right? Is modern construction sort of more airtight, more sealed off, less conducive to allowing this kind of natural state of things to occur inside the walls?
Yeah, that's right. So the modern Western home, often has windows that don't open very easily or don't open at all. It tends to be very sealed off. Everything is sealed super tightly. And what we see when you look in a home like that is that the better sealed it is, the more the home is almost exclusively dominated by species associated with human bodies, and then with really weird sort of modern habitats like soap dishes. And we see it. Deanna Beasley at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga has a paper that she's finished where she shows that daycares are almost exclusively human-associated microbes, because the windows are not being opened, the outside's not coming in, and those don't change from season to season. It's just a reflection of our own falling apart. And if you contrast that with what our ancestors might have been living like, if you look at chimpanzee nests have almost no chimpanzee-associated microbes or insects. And they're almost totally dominated by a species associated with soil, with sticks, with leaves. And so we've made this shift really quickly without thinking about all the consequences. And so the chimps are actually living, with regard to their housing, a better life in many ways than we seem to have offered ourselves.
One final question. You said earlier that you used to study the rainforest and that this was a kind of under-researched area, the wildlife that exists in the places where we spend most of our time. Is it a growing area of research? And how do you make an argument for the importance of looking into this?
Yes, so the study of life in houses is for sure growing, in no small part because the Sloan Foundation pushed a bunch of money toward it 10 years ago or so, and sort of really moved a lot of researchers in the direction of studying life in houses. But we're still very ignorant about this life. And so if you breathe in each breath you take, there are 1,000 or so species in that breath. And most of those species don't yet have names. They've never, ever been studied. And so I think, we owe it to ourselves to at least understand that, what's going into our lungs when we breathe, and what does it mean for our well-being? What do those species potentially offer to society? And, if we're going to understand anything at all, it seems like it should be those species, and that we're still so ignorant is both wonderful as a biologist, because it means that we can make grand new discoveries all the time, and sort of horrifying when thinking about one's own health and well-being.
So it sounds like the things that we think that we should be horrified by are actually not, and that we should be horrified in a way by the opposite, the fact that we're trying to eradicate it.
I think that's right. We should be horrified by a house that's totally sealed up and lets none of outdoor nature in and is dominated by the things that fall from our body. If you go into a house that looks scrubbed clean from top to bottom, it should worry you.
Okay. All right. Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my great pleasure. Thank you.
Rob Dunn is the author of Never Home Alone, From Microbes to Millipedes, Camel Crickets and Honeybees, The Natural History of Where We Live. Joining us now are book critics Dwight Garner, Jen Salai, and Parl Siegel. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Happy New Year.
Same to you.
It's been a while since you all have been here, and I think partly, as we talked a little bit about last time, it's because the books at this time of year are not necessarily the most exciting. Does it pick up in January?
A rough question.
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I had some exciting books that I reviewed and I thought were interesting to sort of think about. But yeah, generally the bigger books start coming out in the spring.
But you were very enthusiastic about the book that you reviewed this week, Parl.
Yes, I was. I reviewed a book called Mouthful of Birds by Samantha Schweblin, an Argentine writer. And it's a book of 20 short stories that are all beautifully, gaudily insane and surrealist, and they belong to the same universe. There's sort of things that keep coming up. Children are buried. There's strange holes in the ground. There's this ongoing problem of communication. There's these, this preoccupation with motherhood, horrifying scenarios around it, and it's just these beautiful, prickly stories full of dread that feel kind of like hallucinations. Some of them are just a page or two long. And I first heard of Schweblin when Jen reviewed her I think it was like her first book published in English called Fever Dream, which is an incredibly deranged, beautiful book. You read it in about 10 minutes. You don't breathe once. I still think Fever Dream is the book to read by Schweblin. But I think what I tried to discuss in my review is that this book lacks that kind of taut perfection. But because of that, you can kind of see her thinking and practicing. This book was written before Fever Dream. So, you do see the experimentalist a little bit. You see her being like, well, let me be a little opaque. Let me try to be a little bit more blunt. Let me try these different strategies, which is really interesting because then you see after this book the incredible achievement of Fever Dream, which she just settles on this voice and this story and this beautifully layered narrative that's just, it's a work of like technical virtuosity. Like I've read it and I both wanted it out of the house immediately and then I wanted to also read it again to be like, how did this book happen?
What do we know about the author?
She is considered to be probably one of the best Spanish language writers of her generation. She lives in Berlin now because she enjoys, quote, the productive solitude. And she's interesting. She's said that she learned, sort of got her love of literature from reading the Americans and reading people like Cheever and Carver. And you can feel some of those voices in her fiction. She has an interesting perspective on what the job of the artist is, and it really is it is to be the person who goes out to the outer limits of dread, and who goes to dangerous places and kind of warns the rest of us or sort of gives us a way to encounter terrible, frightening things in manageable doses. So there is something always like this underlying project she has to sort of really talk about what frightens us in life or in dreams.
And you think you wrote in your review that she stopped talking when she was 12.
She does. This woman cannot give a boring interview. So anything I've read by her, I was just like trying to find a way to cram it in. She stopped talking at the age of 12. And the principal told her parents, we need a sort of letter from a doctor saying that she's normal. Otherwise, if she's not going to go to high school, we don't want her here. And her psychotherapist wrote this letter saying, she's perfectly normal, just absolutely uninterested in the world. And I think one of the things, which again is so grand, I think I say this in the review, like, what a fantastic diagnosis to get when you're kind of like a surly kid.
Well, also, it's like Argentina is sort of the place for psychoanalysis, whereas
you could have probably gotten a note for saying anything.
Right, exactly.
But it's interesting, but when you do read these stories, these are stories that are obsessed with ethical questions and obsessed with environmentalism in particular and toxins and toxicity of all kinds. So it's both incredibly fun to read, and it also feels like you're really dealing with something at least for me, just feels like philosophically nourishing as well. So
Were these themes prevalent in Fever Dreams as well?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, and I've only read a few of the stories in Mouthful of Birds. But yeah, Fever Dream is definitely, you sort of see, and one of the things that Pearl mentioned in her review, which I really liked, was this idea of vision, that even when, some of the stories don't quite work, that you just get the sense of somebody who's really, taking on a lot and trying to, process isn't really the right word, but really trying to sort of grapple with something.
There's some other calling. There's some other kind of roar behind her work.
Yeah.
And like the people that like we love and we last, it's never because, at least for me, like the stories can be, competent and smart and the characters can be memorable. But for me, it always goes back to there's something else behind it, some big set of questions or spiritual yearnings or something else. It's just like you can hear it in her work.
And it's not resolvable.
No.
And I think that's the thing.
And that's what gives you a body of work.
Exactly.
Because she's going to keep going back and she's going to keep doing these things. And again, like I was thinking about it, just like why review this book? Because in some of the stories are excellent, some are so mediocre. But there is this feeling you get from just sort of watching this arc is going to happen. And more of her books are going to be translated. And I think we're going to keep seeing really interesting things from her. I hope so.
Speaking of topics that are returned to again and again and again and again, Jen, what did you review this week?
So the book I reviewed this week is called Act Natural, and it's by a writer named Jennifer Traig. And she calls it a cultural history in misadventures in parenting. And essentially what she does is she looks at, the long history of advice given to parents, and she mostly focuses on how wrong most of it was, and not only wrong, but sometimes truly dangerous. And she injects a little bit of memoir into it. She's the parent of 2 children. And so what she says is that what she's always looking for in parenting books is some reassurance that what she's doing is okay. And so what she finds in these books that are generally wrong is that nobody really knows, for the most part, what's correct or what's right. And I should also say that she really focuses on the tradition of parenting advice given to, Western, fairly well-to-do people, because that's the tradition that she lives in and that she knows.
When I started writing for the Times, and this is, Dwight, you were here at that time, you still couldn't use the word parenting. It wasn't Times style.
I don't remember that.
Yes,
Because
it was
a
child rearing.
neologism?
Yeah, and it just like to parent, you don't.
It's a fairly new
It's a
word.
fairly new term.
Oh, wow,
it's so professionalized.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that now it's so accepted.
Yeah, I think now it's part of the vocabulary. I think she says the verb to parent came about because of a particular book, I think in 1970. So that's pretty new as far as terms go.
I'm already sick of it.
There you go.
Was there anything new in this book?
Not really. I mean, I think, it's the kind of subject where there's been so much that's been written about it. What she tries to do is, she makes it very accessible. She's a good storyteller. She's a very skillful writer, but she's a terrible joke teller, and that was
The joke sounded awful that you quoted.
I have to admit that I found it really hard to get past that, which is a shame, because actually some of the facts that she gathers, even if you can find them elsewhere, she sort of puts them together, in a really, sort of in a way that you can really apprehend them and sort of see what the relevance is. But then, she can't, at the end of every paragraph, there's a punchline. And even when she has a decent punchline, she'll have a footnote that takes it further.
Kills the joke.
Totally.
I also feel like it feels like there's a cultural imperative, like add humor,
Yes.
to this discussion.
Well, I think I can understand it, because I do, one of the things that I mentioned in the review is just so much writing about parenting is just so pious. It's so sort of sanctimonious. I mean, and there is a genre of parenting book that tries to be wacky.
Yes,
yes.
And
her
the mommy
book,
blog.
Yeah, and her book, I think that's what she's trying to do.
See, was it the jokes that were killing me in your review? It was the all caps.
Oh, she does that too, yeah. Italics, all caps.
Is there a book that you guys have read about parenting or child rearing that has a tone that you've liked?
It's interesting. I don't know that tone ever...
That hasn't been the sort of selling point.
No, I think I go more to the concrete. I think the tone always irritates me in the same way that, to a certain degree, other parents are always kind of irritating in some way. I think in terms of tone, it's the books that are not parenting books, but that are books that in some way deal with parenthood in a way that I find to be interesting, where the tone, I mean, one example is Rachel Cusk's book, Life's Work, which a lot of people are put off by her tone, but I actually quite like.
I think tone for me is so important when it comes to this sort of stuff. And again, like trying to find something that doesn't feel pious. Like, I loved Cusk's book when I read it before I had children. After I had a child, I find it very difficult, It's
off-putting to you?
Yeah, I mean, I find the like sort of way that all forms of caretaking are just seen as a form of depletion of the self. I find it bizarre, you know? Even though I like a lot of her stuff, like I after having, done it I just found that very strange. But going back to tone, the book I love and that I sort of recommend sort of like most indiscriminately is Anne Enright's book, Making Babies, which I think Dwight reviewed.
I did. It's terrific.
Right.
It's so good. It's so strange and like full of awe without being cloying and messy. And I think she wrote it on these like little fragments as the baby slept. She would write it on like receipts and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's Rachel Cusk without the loathing.
Yeah.
Well,
I think she has more of a sense of humor than Rachel Cusk.
Yeah, no, she's absolutely.
She's
absolutely.
delightful.
I will also say in defense of Rachel Cusk, and I haven't read her book in years or reread her book in years, but I feel like it also depends, maybe a lot of it is contingent on what one's own personal experience as a new parent was. And I think because Rachel Cusk had a colicky baby and I had a colicky baby. And so when I read her book, it was sort of in those moments, those very rare moments when my wonderful but colicky baby was actually sleeping and not crying, that I really felt, oh, finally, here is a book that gets it. Whereas I think exactly like when it comes to Anne Enright's book, which I liked, but I just didn't, I could see that she had a totally different experience with her kids than I did.
With the Cusk, I didn't read it when my babies were young. I read it
later?
Oh, yeah. I read it maybe 3 or 4 years ago after they were, sort of fully hatched. So I think I didn't take any of it personally in a way. When my children were wee babies, all I wanted was like extremely concise information.
Advice.
Like, yes, I wanted like the
that was good.
The contented little baby, like ways to get your child to sleep. Essentially, were the great priority.
Dwight, did you have a book that you loved?
No, you were right to mention Anne Enright. Well, I love that book. Other than that, I'm trying to think. I did like the Rachel Cusk as well. I'm trying to think of books written by men about fatherhood, at least of young children. I can't honestly think of one.
They're pretty bad, Dwight. A few years ago, I wanted to write something about like books about fatherhood, and I was looking at a bunch of them, and they're just like, I don't know why.
New fatherhood,
like written by like some pretty established writers, and I was like, I don't know. There's a piece to be written if I can even figure out why they're bad the way they are or why they put me off. But there's nothing you can.
No, it was either Germaine Greer or Catherine Whitehorn who said that this was back in the 70s that every man who's changed a diaper has written a book about it, and I don't think that's true anymore. But it probably was then.
So Dwight, I feel like my issues with the book that I reviewed weren't entirely disconnected from some of the concerns that you had with the book you reviewed.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I reviewed a book this week called Hollywood's Eve by Lily Anolik, who's a writer at Vanity Fair. And she's written a sort of quasi-profile, quasi-biography of the great Eve Babbitt, who is the author of 2 memoirs that are especially great. One is called Slow Days, Fast Company, and the other one is called Eve's Hollywood. And she's written some novels as well, but the novels aren't so great. They're okay. In this book, she loves Eve Babbitt so much, Lily Anolik does, that she kind of just throws herself at her wildly, and just kind of like, hits her mark, but in this kind of
so
crazy.
Many did though.
Right. Well, yeah, someone said about Eve, and this is in the book, that every man once in his life has a woman like Eve Babbitt, and then the end of the quote is usually it's Eve Babbitt. So because she got around, she had conquests. Eve did. She once wrote Joseph Heller a letter that said, "Dear Joseph Heller, I'm the author of Catch-22. I'm 18 years old. I'm stacked, and I'm like here waiting for you." It was like the letter she sent to her. So she was kind of masculine in some ways, like seducer. I mean, she went out and got what she wanted, and what she wanted, as she says many times, was sort of everything. I mean, she just became this deliriously talented writer about sex and food and just wanting everything in the world. I compared her once in print to Colette. She reminds me a bit of a modern day Colette. Yeah. And anyway, the books to read, as I mentioned about her, are Slow Days, Fast Company, and Eve's Hollywood. In this new book, it's it's all over the place. It has good things and bad things. And she kind of smothers her subject with love. It's kind of like reading a book about Whitman. I mean, Whitman was so good at singing himself, and so was Eve Babbitt's, that reading someone else singing Whitman somehow is a step down from Whitman singing himself. And I felt that way about this book. I'd rather just read Eve on her own life. But Lily Analik has done some homework and brings some facts to bear on a lot of the topics.
I have to ask
Eve's
on a
life.
very superficial note, was Eve Babbitt's her given name? Because what a perfect name given your description of her.
It was her given name. And it was given to her by a famous composer whose name I'm forgetting now. I mean, Eve Babbitt grew up in L.A. in the 50s and 60s, and her father worked for the studios, and her mother was an artist. And she had this glamorous life. And she posed with Marcel Duchamp when she was 18 or 19, naked, playing chess, and he was clothed. And just from the very start, she had this sort of extraordinary life, plugged into the world in all sorts of ways. And she easily could have just gone off the rails, and she almost did at one point. I've been thinking about her phrase, because here we are a few days after New Year's, and we're all a little bit partied out. And her phrase was squalid overboogie, that she felt she was going to die from, just the drugs and the sex. And when she was 28, she made a kind of sharp turn and began writing about her life instead of just, living it.
What explains her sort of resurgence in the last couple of years? Because it seems like she's very hot right now. People talk about her. People seem to be rereading her. She's just sort of become back.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened. I mean, her books at the time didn't really sell, but it wasn't like they were. I mean, one was published by Knopf, or one or two were, so it wasn't like she was a nobody. But her books never quite, sold in the 70s and 80s when they appeared, and so they all went out of print. And then Lily Analik in Vanity Fair wrote a piece in 2014, and then the New York Review books reissued two of them, and now Counterpoint is doing the novels. But if you like Nora Ephron, if you like Colette, if you just like smart, observant writing about, being alive. I mean, and it's sort of alternative version of L.A. It's sort of a lighter look at L.A. compared to someone like Joan Didion. I mean, Eve Babbitt in some ways wrote in opposition to Didion, whose portrait of L.A. was kind of gloomy, and Babbitt sort of finds a way to celebrate it.
All right, let's run down the books that we each discussed quickly. Pearl?
I discussed Mouthful of Birds by Samantha Schweblin.
And the book I reviewed this week was Act Natural by Jennifer Traig.
I reviewed Hollywood's Eve by Lily Analik.
All right, Dwight, Jen, Pearl, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, albeit not right away. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague, John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.